Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 58th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Herein, the prophet Isaiah describes and differentiates between the true and the false worship, or the sincere and the hypocritical. So he prophesied during an apostate age, and this is evident as early as the first chapter. The people are in the practice of offering all these animal sacrifices but not repenting. They're sinning and they keep offering these sacrifices, so they're just in a hamster wheel of sort. But their sacrifices have become so numerous that Yahweh no longer delights in the smell of them. And so, as the prophet, he was one of the prophet's functions was to restore the true spirit of the religion, which was usually lost in most generations, although Isaiah's 40-plus year prophetic career does span the range of several kings. He did live to witness revival in the reign of Hezekiah. But there's several practices in the 58th chapter. There's fasting, there's Sabbath observance, and they're likened to forms of denial. And the whole reason we worship, we have to define what the goal of is our worship. And as I see it, the aim and ideal of worship is to have a dynamic encounter with the living God, who is not only alive but present in your midst. But when we do these spiritual disciplines and practices apart from the spirit of the one who we do it towards, then we're missing him. We're not only missing the mark, we're missing him whose presence is vital. So any worship in which, any act of worship where he is not present and blessing it is in vain. So we do want to be careful to avoid that and never lose sight of the possibility that if we catch ourselves going through the motions of religion and just doing these laundry list of do's and don'ts, we better check our spirit while we're logging the miles. So the opening verse reads, "Cry aloud, do not spare, lift up your voice like a ram's horn. Declare to my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins." This is Yahweh speaking to his prophet, and he's instructing him to raise a mighty cry, cry aloud, do not spare, hold nothing back, do it without reservation, do it with abandon, and lift up your voice like a ram's horn that would have projected a loud noise. And he's going to tell his people of their sin, because it is essentially screaming from the earth all the way up to his ear in heaven. So he needs to silence this sin by sending his prophet to proclaim not only against it, but loudly so. And the house of Jacob would have been the nation of Israel. They were prone to sin throughout their history, and Isaiah's generation was certainly no exception. So there's always there's usually a contrast between the people, the priest, and the prophets, which there's really a distance between them in terms of correct spirituality. "Yet they seek me day by day, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and did not forsake the just judgments of their Elohim. They ask me of rulings of righteousness. They delight in drawing near to Elohim." So this is some positive praise, but it's going to turn negative sharply after this. What he says here is that they are diligently seeking him, and they have a genuine desire to know more of his ways. And this was the reason that Israel existed. They were to be a nation that did righteousness. They were to be a kingdom of priests, visible and verbal witness to the world of Yahweh, their deity, who is not only their creator. He had chosen them from all creation, but he is in fact the universal creator of everything and anything and everyone. And they desire in coming close or drawing near to Elohim. So this is the purpose of worship. That's how we knew it, if we're doing it correctly, if we are coming close to him, and so much so that we can feel his presence alive and in our midst. "Why have ye fasted, and you have not seen? And why have you afflicted our souls, and took no note? Look, in the day of your fasting you find pleasure, and drive on all your laborers." So Yahweh's kind of mimicking the caricature of the people who, this is still him speaking, of the people who were fasting as if he should notice, as if that was somehow pleasing and acceptable in his sight, because as we're eventually going to read, they were still oppressing even while they were fasting, so they weren't really worshiping. If we're not making the world a better place, if we're persisting in our sin, if we're still thinking of plotting and scheming how to get away with it all when we're fasting, then we're not really worshiping. Look, you fast for strife and contention, and to strike with the fist of wickedness. You do not fast as you do this day, to make your voice heard on high. So we have a New Testament parallel in terms of the hypocritical fasters as described by the Savior in the 16th through 18th verses of Matthew's 6th chapter. And the same thing that they did was the same thing that the abuse practitioners of prayer and also alms did. They made a noise. They presented themselves loudly. So they are they're doing it for attention and publicity, and their motive is selfish, even though the purpose of fasting is self-denial, which draws one closer to Elohim, who we offer the sacrifice to. And we ought to be mindful of his creation while we are in the midst of such a sacrifice of self-denial. But they were not concerned about the poor they were oppressing. When I fast, I personally am more mindful of the fact that certain people do not have the luxury of 3 meals a day that, people like you and I probably take for granted. Is it a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head like a bulrush and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Do you call this a fast and an acceptable day to Yahweh? So there is nothing wrong with these items in themselves, but they are the mere minimum. These are the ritualistic motes of repetition that one goes through. So they were concerned. They thought they had a form. They had a form of worship, but they really were a denial because their form was a lie. It was hypocritical and false. And hypocrisy has been likened to the vice which pays virtue homage. So they think they are righteous, but they are in fact unrighteous. And, of course, this isn't acceptable to Yahweh because that's the whole reason we fast, to be made more acceptable and closer to him. So we don't we don't endorse the extreme of asceticism, although we do personally endorse and embody disciplined eating and exercise routine, but that's probably not necessary. Is this not the fast that I have chosen, to loosen the tight cords of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, to exempt the oppressed, and to break off every yoke? So none of these things are quite like fasting, so the implicit inference is that he prefers these things to them just fasting to no avail, to no benefit. They are not entering into acts of worship. They are depriving themselves, thinking that they are earning Elohim's favor. They're ultimately using him as a superstitious good luck charm, much like the repeated sinners who were habitually offering slaughterings without offering any true repentance. They thought they were just forgiven just because they paid the money for the sacrificial animal. That's not the way it works. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out, when you see the naked and cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh? So the self-righteous people of any Jewish generation would sooner not lift a finger than to come into any ceremonially suspect contact with someone else. So this posed a huge dilemma. We witnessed this in the Good Samaritan parable, where the priest and Levites who walk by, they're doing their thing, they're doing their work, but they're not responding to the ministry in the midst, and that's ultimately related to something I forgot, so I'm just going to move on. Then your light would break forth like the morning, and your healing spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The esteem of Yahweh would be your rear guard. That's some pretty powerful protection right there. The esteem of Yahweh has got your back. That means nothing is going to penetrate past you or even before you. and our righteousness is nothing. It's like into filthy rags by the same author in the 64th chapter in the 5th verse. But when we have his righteousness, then we are a force to be reckoned with in the judgment, because in and of ourselves we are nothing. There is nothing within us. We are all wholly and miserably insufficient to bring satisfaction to our Maker, at least in ourselves. But when we accept his righteousness, then we are in and go. It seems a little too good to be true, but it really is an act of faith. And the process of salvation is simple but not easy. Then when you call, Yahweh would answer. When you cry, he would say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and the speaking of unrighteousness. So this is how you know you're praying wrong. If you don't receive any answers or promptings or are more wise or calm or focused for having done so. And so people often, and this is one of their complaints we read of in the next chapter, this first and second verse, I can paraphrase. It reads, Yahweh's hand is not slack that he cannot hear your voice or reach out his arm, but your iniquities have separated us between you and him and you. So that's a minimal paraphrase at best, but to the point of the passage. We know we are worshiping correctly. If Yahweh responds, that means he hears us and he is giving us the answer we seek, and he will give the assurance of his presence, which is a comfort in his self, and we surrender his yoke. He is meek and needy, and come to me, all ye who are heavy laden, Matthew 11:28. And the speaking of unrighteousness, that's what Isaiah's job was. Remember, in the first verse, cry aloud, do not spare anything. Speak with full abandon, vim, and ver about the iniquity of the nation that I have sent you to warn. If you extend your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light shall dawn in the darkness, and your darkness be as noon. That's actually a really beautiful statement. It really hopped out to me right here, having reread this chapter. The whole point of religion and spirituality is to make the world a better place, or that's at least our earthly duty, and that is when we act in a manner that is consistent with the character of its creator. So if we are to treat the least among us as the greatest amongst us, because the judge above us is the great equalizer and the consummate Democrat. The light that you exude will penetrate any area of darkness. It will be visible no matter how dark it gets, no matter how difficult it is. Your light and his light will always be there, and it's going to make wherever you are not only not dark, but as bright as noon. Then Yahweh would guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought and strengthen your bones, and you shall be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. So the continual guidance means we must not only we must abide in the one we come to. We cannot come to him once, and it's not a one and done thing. We have to cultivate a relationship throughout the course of what we have left of life. And then we can, through consistent cultivation, we can be assured of his guidance, and he will satisfy our soul as no other item on heaven or earth can. He can satisfy it uniquely, and any substitute form of superior satisfaction is tantamount to idolatry, in my personal view. So they're going to be physically restored, strengthened bones. They're going to be like a water that replenishes itself. Their waters do not fail, so never-ending abundant supply of water, which is vital to survival and has spiritual symbolisms. And those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up the fountains of many generations, and you would be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. So from their desolation and ruin, which is going to come to them sooner than expected, as Isaiah makes known, but they're going to have a restoration, and this ultimately alludes to Nehemiah, the great wall builder, who I personally and a great many other people liken to President Trump in a lot of ways, and I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, Nehemiah, and Trump, history repeating itself, ? So Nehemiah was the repairer of the walls. He made Jerusalem a force to be reckoned with. Their enemies from every direction could no longer come and take their pickings and rob them dry and leave them on their desolate land. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my sacred day, and shall call the Sabbath a delight, the sacred of Yahweh's esteemed, and shall esteem it, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Now, there's actually a lot to digest here. We're just going to take it from the top. The Sabbath is the other worship. It's the day designated for worship, and the act of fasting is certainly a form of worship, but this is the communal and collective weekly worship, which we are all do well to not live without. The communal element certainly adds a way that fasting, you do that for yourself. It's really to no one else's benefit, but for your own spiritual improvement through the furnace of affliction. And the whole intent of the Sabbath worship is that we do not pursue our own interest. We do not engage in commerce. We do not travel excessively. We do not think about worldly things or things along those lines, but devote it exclusively and as much as we are able to the thoughts of divinity. And then there's also a line about not doing your own ways. So man likes to go his own way and do his own thing, but the results are always, no matter how often we change the formula, the results are always the same. There is a way that seems right unto man, but the end thereof is death, we read in Proverbs 14:12. And nor speaking your own words, this is something I feel is alive and well in my present generation. There's a class of people who are really have no original ideas to call their own, so they just kind of regurgitate whatever it is they hear, whether it's, it doesn't matter where it's from, but the point is that they're not really speaking their own thoughts because they have no thoughts to call their own. Final verse 14, Then you shall delight yourself in Yahweh, and I shall cause you to ride on the heights of the earth, and feed you with the inheritance of Jacob your father. For the mouth of Yahweh has spoken. So they're going to be delighted and satisfied, having gone through it all and done all this stuff. And they have a ticket to heaven, essentially, where they will enjoy the inheritance of Jacob, that is salvation. Isaiah was an Old Covenant Jew, although he does portend or prophesy of the day when the Gentiles would be included in the kingdom in heaven and salvation, the plan of salvation. He was still a creature of his time, and so a lot of Jews thought it was the exclusive possession of descendants of Abraham, and that was all they had to do to get it. But Yahweh said there's no shortcuts in salvation or religion or anything else. So I hope that's why you're here. Christian life is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a 365-day, 24 hours a day race. We finished. The race began over 2,000 years ago, and we run it still. So I hope that's the reason you're here. And these 15 half-hour videos can give you some of the ingredients and the resources and the strategies to make it another day spiritually flourishing and progression to where you were yesterday. So that's all the time we have for. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.